Welcome to this Scrutiny Management Committee public hearing session with the Committee for Environment and Infrastructure. So that's welcome to those present and those watching on the live stream. Today we'll be focusing on the work streams in the committee's mandate that are in the government work plan. I'm Deputy Yvonne Burford, and with me on the panel today are Mr Paul Luxon, as well as the Scrutiny Principal Officer, Mr Mark Huntington, and we were also expecting Deputy Aidan Matthews, who may well turn up during the meeting. It won't be possible to cover everything today in the short time we have available, but in preparing questions, we've endeavoured to be as wide-ranging as possible, whilst at the same time not losing focus on those issues of significant public interest. In addition to the live stream, a Hansard transcript of the hearing will be published in due course on the Scrutiny website. So if everyone would kindly ensure that mobile phones are switched to silent, I will now turn to our witnesses today. If you could introduce yourself, please. Let's start with Mr Hackley.
Thank you. Yes, Damon Hackley, Director of Operations, covering a number of areas, including E&I, economic development, sport and culture, and planning.
Sam Haskins, and I'm the Vice President. Thank you.
Lindsay de Summers, and I'm the President.
Claire Barrett, I'm the Director of Environment and Infrastructure.
Thank you. So we'll start off with the topic of housing, which is obviously of great interest at the moment. Deputy de Summers, a recurrent feature in the rejection of housing developments has been the likely traffic impact. As your committee is responsible for both housing policy and traffic policy, and as it would appear there is too little housing and too much traffic, how do you propose to resolve this conundrum?
Well, I think, first of all, I think you've put your finger on the conundrum very, very accurately. I've been on the record for quite a long time in saying that I think there is a gap in our current state's processes in terms of planning. Planning law can only put so much on the developer, and I think that's quite right. It's not fair to put the whole burden on any one developer for sorting out the transport infrastructure in an entire area. But when we look at it from a site-by-site, development-by-development perspective, what we don't get is cumulative impacts. And so for me, that's something I've mentioned many times before, is I think that's where the states, and specifically where this committee, needs to step in. One of the recent housing planning application rejections did act as a catalyst for change in this respect. So we have agreed a different approach, and we are looking at it in terms of not just specific interventions that might, improve the situation in the near vicinity of the development, but actually taking a more area-wide approach. So we've been quite proactive in terms of talking with the DPA, but most importantly, I think, talking with developers. And we want to look at it from the basis, not of just... I think one of the problems is that when you start with a traffic impact assessment, which the planning process does, it takes as a sort of baseline assumption that what you've got before the development is fine and it's acceptable. And I think often the case is that it isn't. You know, the Guernsey situation has evolved in that things have just developed without much plan or design, and actually the current residents aren't that happy. So I don't think it's okay to take a traffic impact assessment where the baseline assumption is that what's currently there is fine and we just need to not make things that much worse. We want to take a different perspective where we want to look at how we can improve things for the current residents as well as any future residents and make the whole transport network more effective. So we are looking at things like network planning and mobility planning specifically, and we'll be, hopefully you'll be hearing more about that shortly.
That's obviously going to require additional investment.
Yes, basically, we've got the budget to do the initial work that we want to do. Obviously, what comes out of that in terms of recommendations will, in all likelihood, require some budget. But I see this as part and parcel of delivering on housing, on meeting the housing needs. So I think it's really important. And I think it's also an opportunity to not just limit damage, make things less bad, but actually enhance an area and make things work much more effectively than they have done in the past.
Clearly that could require a significant budget, so is that something you envisage coming forward in a future iteration of the government work plan?
Yeah, as I say, I think it's part and parcel of meeting housing requirements. And I think actually when you compare it to some of the other costs associated with housing, it might not be quite as eye-watering. I'm hoping, we don't know. I think some quite effective things can be brought about through relatively inexpensive interventions. So we'll see.
We just had the planning application for Leal's Yard put in. That's obviously, even listening to the sort of vox pops that were done by the media, one of the things that came to the fore then was traffic on the bridge, which can be, a difficult area to move presently, which underlines, I suppose, the point that you were making in your first answer. Clearly, some of it will be transferred if the co-op store moves from one end of the bridge to the other. But what do you think the states should be doing where traffic is concerned in relation to this development?
Well, I think the first thing I'll say about the development, and I would caveat this with the fact that I haven't had a chance to look at the detailed plans. I'm not sure anyone has, but I certainly haven't. But from what I know of it at the moment, I am fairly encouraged by the amount of thought that has gone into transport connectivity. And I think some of the basic principles that they've embedded in those plans are sound and helpful and give us a good platform from which to build. I also think Leal's Yard is an absolute cornerstone development in terms of that whole area. And it will enable us. So some of the things they include, sorry, I should quickly do a little detour. Some of the things that they are looking to include is better, and by better I mean safer and more attractive and more convenient access for alternative forms of transport, like particularly active travel. So it's a permeable site from multiple directions. It discourages rat running. For motor vehicles, which I think is essential. It does stick to fairly good principles in terms of where to keep your vehicle movements, i.e. more on the periphery, and open up that middle space to be much more people-centric. And also it includes an element of shared mobility, which is something I feel is going to be a really important aspect for Guernsey going forward, because it enables enables people to get about by car, which is a mode they're very comfortable and familiar with, and which much of the island is kind of designed around car access. But it's a much more space-efficient way of using cars, because it's not just one vehicle per person kind of thing. It can be, it's much, there was a study in the UK a few months ago which showed that for every shared car, it negated the need for 18.5 privately owned vehicles, which is quite an impressive, I think, saving when you think about that, how that translates into space. But to answer your question more directly, one of the things that will come to E&I to help shape is the bridge strategy. And I don't know if Claire wants to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I'm happy to as well. But I think that's the opportunity where we get to consider those broader considerations in terms of how we make sure that there's excellent connectivity through the whole area, and not just within the development and within the parameters that the planning law can extend to the development.
And what's the time scale on that?
Well, the bridge strategy, which is also a government work plan work stream, has been developed, and it also crosses over into the flood defence, which is a requirement of Leal's Yard going forward. So that's been addressed. At the moment, we're progressing the flood defence part of it because we don't want to be holding up Leal's Yard. But there is a crossover with the wider local planning brief for St Sampson's now, which, because of the debate last week, actually requires the local planning briefs to come forward for that. So what we might find is that other than the flood defence, the wider bridge strategy gets wrapped into the Harbour Action Area local planning brief, so that we can look at all the advantages of that.
Right, and so the timescale on that is in terms of years in that case?
It's potentially, yes. I mean, the local planning briefs we want to progress as quickly as possible, so that those steps are in place. I think, what we don't want to do is to develop the bridge frontage in isolation from all the other possibilities. I think at the point the bridge strategy was highlighted in the government work plan last year, there wasn't on the table the potential for St Sampson's Harbour Action Area to come through. It was St Peter Port first and then St Sampson's. So it was a way in bringing some of it. It was almost like a phased approach. But I think now that we know that the wider St Sampson's Harbour Action Area is coming forward, that it makes sense to look at it comprehensively.
If I can just add one thing to that, is that if the state is able to give some clearer strategic direction about commercial shipping and the use of St Sampson's Harbour as well, that will enable us to move on that bit of work with a lot more clarity as well, because obviously it makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I appreciate that part of it's not in your mandate as such, but that was going to be my next supplementary question. Does the decision not have to be made on commercial harbours first?
I mean, I'll let Claire give the planning view, but my view, my understanding is that that is one of the most fundamental things that we need to know, because whether commercial shipping comes into the harbour in future, or whether we're planning to keep commercial shipping, or whether we're planning to change it into leisure only, is going to shape how that area is designed and used.
Did you have anything you wish to add, Mrs Barrett?
Not unless you've got any specific questions about the detail.
I was just reading from Deputy de Summary that you might have a slightly different view on it. Moving on from that aspect, given that your committee is mandated to advise the states on general housing policy in relation to land use, spatial planning and infrastructure, how do you believe the states should be looking to solve the current housing crisis?
Well, I think, I hate to be a broken record, but I do think transport is absolutely key, because I think one of the big blockers of delivering housing at the moment, the reason that planning applications attract quite so much opposition in some cases, is because we have a very space inefficient transport system, which basically we need to decouple housing density from vehicle density. It's vehicle density that creates the pressure on the infrastructure that takes up a lot of space that could be used for other purposes. So I really do think that accelerating that transport transition, if you like, is going to be one of the most important factors in terms of meeting our housing requirements generally. But I'm not sure if it was your question, but obviously we've managed to get the general housing enabling law in place now, so there will be ordinances being brought forward to meet those particular requirements. I'm really sorry, I've sort of lost track of what your original question was driving at.
Right, it was just really how you thought that Guernsey can solve its current housing crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's encouraging is obviously we have been working through the Housing Action Group, known as HAG, up until this point, and we've got to make a decision about what replaces that, if anything. So the focus of that was really about what can we progress quickly, and now we've sort of been through that process that has delivered some things, it's allowed us to scope others. The work that's going to come back to this committee is market interventions, for example. So that's one of the things that will come back to E&I from the HAG process, because that sits clearly in our mandate.
So market interventions, could you just, for those listening, give some idea of what sort of things those could be?
Yeah, so policy interventions, basically where, how, or if the government should step in terms of, for example, supporting first-time buyers, providing plots for people to develop, that kind of thing, which, making finance more available to a broader range of people. So it's policy interventions that enable more housing needs to be met.
But when it comes down to it, it's essentially money provided by the government to...
It doesn't necessarily need to be money, but I think that's often the main focus, but it could be include things like land.
Okay, which again is an asset, so it's, yeah. Just moving to one side on that slightly, but still with the housing crisis, with pressure in some quarters to increase the population, particularly in the light of demographic challenges. Do you think that if that does happen, that actually we'll never get to the end of the housing crisis because the demand will always outstrip the supply?
Well, I think we need to recognise that there is a mismatch between supply and demand at the moment. So irrespective of any future projections on population, we are currently at a point where our existing housing stock is not able to meet the needs of the people that are looking for homes. And I mean, not just in terms of numbers, but probably more specifically in terms of type. And actually, we have been in the process of developing a tool which should really help this, which is called the State's Strategic Housing Indicator. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it is a tool that will give us a more granular and more practically useful insight into housing need at a more specific level in terms of matching housing type as well as just overall number. Now, obviously, we call it an indicator. It used to be called a target, and that was problematic because, for the most part, leaving aside social housing or the housing brought forward by the GHA, what housing is, permissions are applied for and most importantly are then developed is not in the direct control of the state. So we can influence the types of housing that people are planning to build, and that's pretty much as far as we can go in that respect.
Okay. Yes, please do.
Good morning. Not wanting to throw a spanner in the works, I think your point around there's already a deficit of housing stock and these things can happen. And bear in mind, Guernsey's pretty much antipathy towards any kind of vertical developments in our island. And with the likelihood of some population growth being essential because of the ageing demographic, does the committee have a view yet about whether we should be prepared for some tasteful, higher vertical housing development on the basis we've got a 26-mile finite land mass, and I don't want to get into land reclamation of any bays around the island, but do you think it's time that we have to just, as a community as well as a government, just reconsider this resistance to some sort of tasteful vertical residential developments?
Yeah, what I would say is that I think you're quite right, and I think I can go as far as speaking on behalf of the committee and saying that we definitely recognise that the availability of land is an issue, and how we use it is super important. And I'm always very, very keen to look at spatial efficiency. It's why I think transport is such a key part of that, because it's if you do your transport system well, you use space in a much more efficient manner. So I think I can safely speak on behalf of the whole committee that everyone is very aware of the spatial land use requirements. And I also would say that actually under our current, both the SLUP and the IDP, the Spatial Land Use Plan and the IDP, that is already recognised and encouraged. I think where it doesn't necessarily translate into physical reality is in the cultural resistance to that. But you did remind me that I didn't really answer Deputy Burford's second part of the question at all. So I think we need to recognise that we're in a place where before we can even get to the starting line on population management, there's a sort of deficit, if you like, that we need to address. And there is a separate piece of work, and I'm grateful that I've been involved in some of those discussions as well in terms of the population review. And we are very keen that the population review is considered as simultaneously as possible with housing, the strategic housing indicator side of things, because I think an understanding of what the land use requirements might be, the housing requirements might be, is going to be a really important factor in the conversation around population.
So that is being considered holistically?
It is being, yes.
Right, okay, thank you. Kind of following on from Mr. Luxon's question, Do you think the island can meet its housing needs without building on green fields other than those in centres and centre outer areas, which are all already designated for such under the IDP?
Well, I think, we need to have the debate on the next lot of the state strategic housing indicator, and we need to understand what the population policy is going to be to really answer that question. But I would say that the planning policy at the moment is to concentrate development in those local and main centres, and I think that is really important. And you're quite right to point out that there are some greenfield sites. I would like to say that nobody likes the idea of building on greenfield sites, except perhaps the accountants of developers, because I think it's probably a lot cheaper than building on brownfield. But I think that one of the problems is that, again, these sites are not, on the whole, owned by the states. These are owned by private individuals, and we've got no control over what are brought forward. But I do believe that the DPO is doing there's a 5-year review. I don't know if it's still 5 years, but a 5-year review of the IDP. And I think this is an issue about whether we distinguish really between brownfield and greenfield within the permissible developable areas. I think that's a conversation that we need to have. That's my personal opinion. I would say that's not necessarily something that we've discussed as a committee.
Okay. Deputy Haskins, were you looking to add something there?
No, but I think Lindsay's right, and I think, Paul, you make a very valid point. Speaking personally, the build up, not out, because if you have a finite amount of space, how can you extrapolate it out and it doesn't work? Or we use up all of our greenfield sites. So I think the question is, if we do that, how do we then sort out or alleviate the transport issues with a much more centralised, localised amount of population in that area? So whether that's incentives, so yeah, that's all I would add.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm just going to build on what Deputy Haskins said, actually, and say that actually the opposite of building within a focused area is sprawl. And that is actually, I know it feels at one level like it makes transport a bit easier, but it doesn't. It actually makes things like public transport routing and things an awful lot more difficult. It spreads things out and it actually exacerbates transport problems. And the same goes for beyond transport as well. In terms of the infrastructure that you need to supply those homes, it's more expensive. Sprawl is expensive. So I think actually just from a general overview, common sense perspective, we need to be able to focus the development of homes in the right areas for the cost efficiency of all involved, and ultimately, at the end of the day, affordability for the people that need to live there.
Okay, moving on slightly from that subject, but just a general question. Given the breadth of your mandate and your key responsibilities in terms of many business as usual activities, is your committee adequately resourced both in terms of human and financial resources?
I feel this is a leading question. People in the room might have heard me mention this once or twice before, but my personal view, and I've never really been very shy about coming forward with it, is that we are very thinly stretched. And I have serious concerns. And actually, the meeting that I was in just before this, was I put those concerns on record again. We have got an incredibly broad mandate, as you rightly say, and I am concerned about key person dependency problems. I'm concerned about the fact that we put an awful lot of work, and important work, on very few shoulders. I'm concerned about the fact that, exacerbating factors include the fact that we're going through this OTOM and PTOM process, property rationalisation, moving of staff. There's a lot of uncertainty. We're moving from one system to another system. There's still a lot of uncertainty. There's been a lot of uncertainty. That's not helping. We've had, in terms of resources, we've had vacancies. I think, first of all, we've lost a lot of expertise over maybe the last 10 years in our area, especially quite specific expertise. So I'm thinking especially in the environmental or ecological area. We've lost a lot of expertise and experience, and that hasn't necessarily been replaced, certainly not like for like. So often there will be similar headcount, but it's people being brought in at a lower level with not that same depth of expertise and experience. So this is my personal concerns, but I know that certainly the committee do share them. And I think we've also had vacancies on our books, if you like, for what strikes me as an extraordinary amount of time. And we're talking, years sometimes. And I just think something's not working, or possibly quite a few things aren't working. So I can't really go into specifics. I'm not going to sit here and name names, or about who's gone where or anything. But I would say I've long had a concern about the thinness and the degree to which our human resource is stretched, and I worry about the impact that has in human terms. And I think as an employer, I would personally like to see us step up a bit.
Well, of course, that has financial implications. But if you say you have unfilled vacancies over a period of time, presumably if they are a vacancy, the resource is actually there for those?
Yeah. I think that's not the only problem, but certainly there have been positions that have been vacant for for what strike me as a surprising amount of time.
And what's the barrier to filling those positions?
Well, I've asked questions around it, but this is where it really goes into the operational side of things. I know that with some of them, certainly we've asked HR to see if they can put the increased remuneration. But I don't know. I think at the moment, we have to look at it in the context of the labour pool in the whole island, and I don't think we're actually that competitive with the private sector. I mean, Damon might be a better person as Director of Operations to comment. I've really been treading all over his turf, and I would say that those are very much my views, and Damon might have a different perspective.
I can add to that. I think I totally agree with what Deputy Summary has said. I think really there is, as Deputy Fairbrush pointed out earlier this week, that I think governments expect to do a lot with little, and that's a problem I think across all committees. And I know that is something that will be looked at as part of the review of the government work plan to see how we can maybe do slightly less and concentrate on those matters that really have an impact, which is obviously going to be very challenging. From the Committee for E&I's perspective, we have been through a process of trying to prioritise the work based on the resources that we have available. But as Deputy Summary has said, it's not necessarily an inability to afford the resources, it's the availability that's the struggle at the moment.
And I think perhaps I should, to be fair, direct this next supplementary to Deputy de Sommery in terms, because you'll see when I ask. How do you square what you've just said and what Mr. Hackley has explained with perhaps the public view that the States is just overstuffed with civil servants?
If the States is overstuffed with civil servants, I haven't found, it's certainly not under E&I's mandate. I know that I don't know if I'm allowed to use his name, but I can't really think of his title. But the civil servant who is ultimately responsible for all operations, Chief Operations Officer, thank you, has said that when they did a bit of a sort of informal audit, I think, of the resource, he agreed that we were particularly in your committee, in the areas under our mandate, and I would just add to Damon's comment that I appreciate that the next iteration of the government work plan is going to see where work could reasonably be streamlined, but that I think this problem stretches not just across policy work, but also across business as usual operations. And these are the kinds of things that we cannot afford to cut back on unless we're prepared to suffer the consequences of that. And we know that in many of the sort of nuts and bolts aspects, so for example, road maintenance and coastal defences, we know that a stitch in time saves 9, and we know that it's much, much more cost effective to get that work done in a preventative manner and in a timely manner than wait for things to go horribly wrong. So I really do worry about cutting back on any of that kind of work, because I think it will be much more costly for us in the longer term.
I think that's why my question focused on the business as usual aspect, and I think it's probably worth saying for people listening that there is the business as usual, which is self-explanatory of each committee, but the GWP that we're particularly talking about today focuses on additional and new work that may not be any less crucial, but that is not in the normal day-to-day running of the committee. And so, but what you are saying is that there is an issue with the resourcing even at business as usual level.
From my perspective, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask a brief extension of that? Because I think in the recent states debate last week or whatever, I think it seemed as though the Assembly uniformly agreed that the government work plan priorities, is it 94, 100, whatever it is, simply are too much for this term at least, and would need to be reassessed, reprioritised. I was just wondering, bearing in mind your comments, which I absolutely understand, do you and your committee, are you having some sleepless nights about what the implications of reassessing the priorities and therefore, I guess, some of those priorities disappearing in terms of that, the impact it could have on what the committee's trying to achieve over this political term?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean, I think there are two ways, two ways you can look at this. I'm concerned from an island perspective, from the perspective of what we know we need to do for the island's overall well-being, if you like, and for future generations. If we're, I mean, I'm not suggesting we are, but purely hypothetically, and I really hope it doesn't come to this, but if we're asked to choose between prioritising the energy transition or housing or climate change, what do we deprioritise from those? I mean, they're very symbiotic as well, aren't they? So I would be concerned, and I'm hoping that we're not being asked to make those kind of choices, and I'm actually quite reassured by the early indications of how work might be reprioritised. It's my completely personal view, not a committee view, because we haven't had a chance to discuss it. But I suppose there is the flip side of that coin, which is if a number of things are bumped up the priorities or kept in the priorities list, are we able to resource that work in a timely manner? I've got concerns. I don't want to make it sound like I'm concerned about the GWP process. I just think we need to be very mindful about what that might involve.
Mm-hmm.
I'll hand over to Mr. Luxon for questions on energy policy. Thanks.
Thank you. So obviously the energy policy with the objectives 2020 to 2050 is important for all of the island, of course. The states agreed the following overall objectives of the energy policies being decarbonisation, security and resilience of supply, customer value and choice, equity and fairness, being supportive of a vibrant economy, and of course greater energy independence more generally. Does the committee believe that these areas remain the key objectives in context of the previous question and comments you just made? I suppose the answer is yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes, and I'll take the opportunity to highlight the interrelatedness of them. But we are currently working on the electricity strategy, which draws together a lot of those strands and is going to be the vehicle through which the states is going to be able to make some pretty important decisions relating to those broader themes. But I think the broader context of what we're seeing across the continent and what we heard in the IPCC report a couple of weeks ago, really underscores the importance of those work streams and that we have no time to lose.
Okay. And I guess building on that, how specifically, how achievable are the specific objectives of decarbonisation and security and resilience of supply? And in what time frame do you think could meaningful progress be achieved?
Well, I'll give you the political time frame, which is we will be bringing back the electricity strategy for debate in the States this year. It's a major piece of work. It's a piece of work that involves talking with or consulting with and working with local energy industry stakeholders and expertise at another level as well, you know, that we commission. It's a really important thing. It looks at a number of different areas, and it basically will be a debate through which we can establish how we prioritise, because there are tensions between those things, you know. So if you take the sort of classic energy trilemma, you've got affordability, very important. You've got security of supply, very important. And you've got environmental impacts, also important. And some of those are not mutually, you know, there's going to have to be a little bit of a trade-off. So we could, for example, say, right, we want to make sure security supply is the most important thing. We want to make sure that we've got this huge resilience in the system. That's the number one project. This is hypothetical, by the way, I'm not saying it is. But if we were to say that, then that would have a significant impact on affordability. So do you see what I mean? We have to find the balance, the appropriate balance. We have to be able to establish the parameters within which to work.
And that's really clear timelines and milestones on the political process.
Yeah.
Beyond that, assuming that works through well, how comfortable are you to anticipate the speed with which then progress could be made beyond that in the practical progress?
I don't know, because some of them will depend on the work that we're doing in the electricity strategy. But I am hopeful that we can give this the priority it deserves. I think it might be useful also, it's not just one piece of work. So the electricity strategy is split into three sort of sub-strategies, I suppose, which is a market strategy, a supply strategy, and a demand strategy. Now, some of those things can be progressed much quicker than others. So, you know, if we're talking about, if at the end of the day, all things considered, we're talking about an offshore wind farm or something, then that's going to have a particular lead-in time. And I would have thought that would be, you know, possibly in the region of 8 years or something like that from woe to go. But there are other things, so especially on the demand side, which I get particularly excited about, because I think that's where you get almost your best bang for your buck, that could be potentially implemented much more quickly. So I don't think it's one single bit of work. I'm confident that the timeline that we're obligated to, that we're signed up to in terms of our international agreements, is eminently achievable. But I think the quicker we can manage that transition in a well-managed way, the better the outcomes are going to be. So I wouldn't like to rush things and create problems within local energy markets or anything like that. It does need to be a really well-managed transition, but I'm confident, actually, especially given the cooperation of some of the, of the energy providers in the island. They've all demonstrated a brilliant attitude towards working with us. I think everyone's keen to crack on and achieve those aims as quickly as possible.
I mean, it is a significant both policy but also operational requirement for the island, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not something that we can ignore, and it is complex.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I just pop in with a supplementary on that, actually, coming from something you just said? You'll probably be aware that the UK published its energy strategy yesterday, and some of the criticism that I've read about that points to the lack of emphasis on demand-side management. Yeah. So that's something that you don't think that if that is a mistake on their part, that's not a mistake Guernsey wants to make?
Definitely not. And we were very conscious about how we structured our electricity strategy into those three sections that I described, so market, supply and demand. And as I said, I think demand, we always have in anything environmental policy related, we always have a hierarchy, don't we? And the top tranche of the hierarchy with energy and emissions is avoid. So if you can avoid creating those emissions, which in energy terms means if you can avoid the need for that energy in the first place, you're going to get the best possible returns. So that's why you tend to get more bang for your buck the higher up that hierarchy you focus. And that's why I personally get very excited about the demand side options, and why I'm particularly pleased that we've structured our electricity strategy in such a way to specifically address that aspect.
Thanks. Just moving on a little bit, and I think many islanders will be interested in these two areas. I'd just like to pose questions to you on. Possibly 20 years ago, pre-millennium, Guernsey could operate below the radar screen as an independent state as such. Now we have to play on the global stage. So macroeconomics, global affairs, sweep across us all the time. And particularly that's applicable to this area of energy. So following the recent events in Eastern Europe that's highlighted the fragility of supply and the real risk, does plugging into the European grid now as a core fundamental part of that electricity work that you were talking about, does that raise additional security issues for the island with the immediacy of what we've just seen happening elsewhere?
I would say, as a first off, we were obviously straight on to the issue of when the situation started to unfold, or before, when it looked likely that it was going to unfold, the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine in the way that it has, we were straight onto our security of supply analysis. And I do need to give a reassurance that there is no risk to security of supply. We are not going to escape the economic impacts, but I have no concerns about the short-term security of supply. I would say that there is no... the kinds of things that you're alluding to are exactly the kinds of considerations, geopolitical risks, that will be factored into the electricity strategy. But I would say that there's no alternative, there is no option where we are entirely free of any geopolitical risk, no matter what variation you put on that. Irrespective of any impacts, you can say, right, well, we're going to, completely surround ourselves with all this sort of locally generated renewable, irrespective of any sort of cost implications of that and whether it meets our kind of affordability aspirations. We are never going to be entirely energy independent in the way that I think some people think we might. It's the geopolitical risk is always going to be there to some extent in some guise or other, and it's a case of making sure that we're resilient and we've got the ability to reduce that risk as far as possible. I've got certainly no concerns over the short to medium term security of supply, and actually I think certainly a lot of the conversations around the British-Irish Council Energy Forum are about how you can use interconnection to reduce your risk further. So, I'm not saying that's the position that we'll end up with, but I think on the international stage there is a recognition of geopolitical risk, but I think really it underscores the need to decarbonise as quickly as possible. That's the single biggest aspect.
And I'm conscious, as we're sat here in this very comfortable Catel Duzaine room, that it could seem quite callous that we're talking about the implications of what is a travesty and a crisis for the people of Ukraine and for the nation. Yeah. We're talking about the impact on our potential supply of energy. Absolutely, so I guess I should just reflect on that. But I suppose building on this, the second example is we've seen now over the last 24 months, certainly last year, with the French dispute over a non-related fishing argument. It doesn't matter about the rights and wrongs, but again, the balance between choice of wanting to pursue the right sources of sustainable, renewable electricity supply with then the risk of security when a major leading world power government, France, could actually play tactics with supply to the islands because of the cable link. Again, perhaps, I don't know if Deputy Haskins wants to build on some of the comments that you've given, but this must be a very testing balance about how to weigh up these factors with these external factors now influencing your choice and decisions as well.
Yeah, I'll just start before handing over if Deputy Haskins would like to add anything by saying again, I know there was a lot of focus in the media, but that was part of our risk analysis. And again, I'd reiterate that we've got no concerns over the short-term security in that respect. There is geopolitical risk in all sorts. If we're generating on island, which is the only other macro option at the moment that would help us fulfil. First of all, security. When you're looking at security of supply, you look at what happens when one of your sources is not available and potentially two of your sources are not available. So that's all part of that set of considerations. But secondly, if we're not necessarily immune from geopolitical risk running our generators on island, because that fuel has to come from somewhere. That relies on supply chains which have got their vulnerabilities in their own right. So you know, there's never an option which is entirely free of those external factors, I would say. It's a question of making sure that we can go through that process, establish what our threshold is for security, you know, how we'd like to deal with that risk, and ultimately making ourselves as resilient as possible.
Well, I think in essence, I think what you're asking is definitely politically, is there a focus now on energy independence because of everything that's going on? And I'd say, for me personally, yes, absolutely. But as Deputy Summary says, there are supply chain issues which are geopolitical too. So there is that balance. But I think you'll find in the States, in the Assembly, there is also that the priority of energy independence is shifting up.
So a focus on, I guess, on risk assessment, contingency planning, but then perhaps accepting the reality of sometimes we have to find least worst compromises proportionate to our size and location.
I completely agree with Deputy Haskins that actually even since the energy policy was debated back in 2020, the aspect of independence has become more of a factor. I think that is well recognised. It's certainly well recognised within our committee, so it has to be given due consideration and weight in those considerations. But I would also point out that our previous, is it extant? I'm not quite sure whether it's extant. Security of supply formula, if you like, was really quite high. There's very high threshold for security. It's a formula called N-2, which I know you will be familiar with. And it's basically saying, you know, when you take out your two major sources of generation, can you still meet peak demand at all times? You know, it's a very high threshold, and that comes at a cost. So this is what I was talking about earlier between the tension between security and affordability. Also, there are tensions between those aspects and environmental impacts as well. So I would say that I completely agree. We do need to look at this, these considerations, but we do need to recognise that if we are going to increase prominence of and priority of independence, that may well have a knock-on effect on affordability. So we're going to have to find where that balance lies, where our tolerances are.
Good luck finding those compromises. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Do you agree with the Chamber of Commerce recent conclusions that the right decisions would be to firstly enter a long-term commercial supply contract with France, and secondly to build the direct 100 megawatt cable to France as soon as practically possible?
No, the electricity strategy is the vehicle through which we need to make decisions that will help inform those decisions. Yeah, sorry. The electricity strategy is the vehicle through which those considerations can be weighed up in order to inform those decisions. So it's really important that we do things in the right order. We don't jump to conclusions. And one aspect that is really important in that electricity strategy is scenario testing. So we are not actually testing, we're not just assuming that interconnection is the right answer. We have been very proactive in seeking the views of our political colleagues, for example. We've brought other committee members into a sort of steering group, I suppose, to make sure that other considerations are taken into account. But we are going to be testing credible scenarios so that we can explore a viable range of options in order to make, hopefully, a well-informed decision at the end of that.
Okay, and so any potential progress on macro renewables locally will also be incorporated in that policy letter?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the first things, well, actually, one of the key requirements, I know this sounds a bit odd, is to clearly define what we mean by low carbon and low emissions energy within the electricity strategy. But then it will be about establishing what mixes, what targets might be the most fortuitous for us, most beneficial for us as an island. So it's that electricity strategy, which is this really key bit of work that will inform how we take it forward. And that's why we're very keen that that bit of work happens this political year, because we're all keen to crack on. And we can't really, no one can. It's very difficult to make investment decisions. If you're an energy industry or you're an investor, you can't make those investment decisions until you've got that platform.
So given the obvious crucial importance of this policy letter, can you narrow down slightly when it's going to come in? I know you've said this year, but...
We want it debated this year, so I'm sure there's
It's due for the end of the year. I think there's a possibility that it's on I believe the 23rd of January.
Okay.
I think
right,
is
so published by the end of the year and debated at the beginning of next year. Okay, thank you. Moving on now to more sort of sustainability issues. Environmental groups have been calling for robust legislation to protect wildlife for many years. Has any progress been made on this?
Yes, that is part of our government work plan work stream. So we are doing some work at the moment on reviewing what legislation is. First of all, I'd say they're right. I think we don't have a wildlife law in the same way that other jurisdictions do. So there is a piece of work going on at the moment which is looking at what legislation we do have in place already and what we don't, more importantly probably, and then recommendations will come forward as a result of that.
Okay. And the GWP states that by the end of this year, Guernsey will have achieved updated legislation regarding environmental pollution and animal welfare. So will the deadline of December 2022 this year be met in both cases?
I don't know, because it will depend on operational resource constraints. So I will certainly endeavour to meet those, but I'll keep you and the rest of the Assembly updated through a general statement if it looks like those can't be met. But certainly that is the aim. I'm hopeful they can be.
Some people might say, and I'm sure it's been said in the past, that the environment has historically been the poor relation of states' policy making and resources, often because there was always deemed to be more important things, namely social policy and fiscal policy. Do you agree with that claim?
I think historically, yes, but I think the scales have tipped significantly in recent times. I think people have more of an understanding, first of all, about the very significant impacts of a changing climate. Obviously, awareness is the greatest it's ever been about the energy transition, for very sad reasons, as Mr. Luxon said. And I think people are also more aware of the interrelationships between, I don't even know if that's a word, but the links between the environment and the economy. So I think, for example, the Dasgupta report was quite seminal in drawing. Actually, I think it started with Professor Stern, didn't it? He was the one that first put that, into mainstream consciousness, that big report, talking about how the environment impacts the economy. And I think awareness has sort of grown from there. I think Guernsey's maybe not been ahead of the curve in that respect. But I think certainly now there is a much stronger recognition of the fundamental importance that the environment plays in the economy and in our well-being as a society. And, ultimately it is what supports us, our lives and our well-being.
And that awareness clearly makes it easier to make progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think because of the economic impacts in particular, I think money has always talked loudest, hasn't it, in policy-making terms. And I think because the economic impacts are so increasingly obvious when it comes to things like the energy transition, that, that's why it's getting a lot more attention than it has previously. But yeah, I think we're making up for lost time now in that respect.
Thank you. I think that's actually a convenient point at which to take a break. Oh, sorry, we've got
one about, and it was really about resources, and I think this applies to really most committees, is that there always seems to be a real constraint on resources, and policy resources in particular.
Yeah.
Do you feel that E&I has got sufficient policy resources to be able to generate the policy letters and create the policies that you want to do?
No, I did cover this in an earlier answer, so I won't repeat what I said, but I will say my short answer is no. I think you're right to put your finger on it, and I think it's probably, something that other committees do experience, but I think we experience it perhaps more acutely than others. I think another issue is because we've got so few people, particularly in policy terms, in relation to the amount and significance, the importance of that policy work. Another of the issues is that, as Damon explained earlier, we took an approach from the start of this term to make sure that everything we were doing on the ground, if you like, had a direct link to policy direction. So we weren't, wasting any resources doing things that weren't a priority. So we've been through a really helpful process, and I understand that process is now being rolled out to other committees. So we end up with work plans for each team. And I think one of the aspects that does concern me slightly is that we can look at that and it all makes sense in its own right. But the thing is, you get the next work plan and it's got many of the same people, and then you get the next one. And, we've got people who are so thinly stretched across these big, very important areas, and they're not areas that I think we want to drop or do inadequately. So I am concerned on the resourcing front, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Just reflecting on the comments that you were sharing with Deputy Burford around that tension between the environment and the infrastructure part of your mandate, it could be said that it's almost an impossible marriage in a way, but it made me reflect back in 2014, I think it was, the previous Public Services Department developed a green paper which it took to the States, the IIP, Island Infrastructure Plan, by memory, and plucking a number from my head, I think it had about 1.46 billion of legacy deficit, catch-up essential infrastructure spend across the whole island and government mandate. Well, obviously we're sort of quite a few years on from then, sort of 8 years on. I'm not sure how much of that will have been invested. And that was just the essentials. That was to keep the islands, roads, airports, harbours. There was then a list of and would be needed to be done at some point, and then there was would nice to be done. So a massive amount back then, just with inflation, that 1.46 billion would be more. Again, I just wonder, from your committee point of view, how you tussle with that. I realise P&R are responsible for managing the overall financial piece, but does again give you sleepless nights trying to balance up these mandate requirements and demands that you have to be able to make real progress?
Do you know what? And I am aware I'm in the company of a former Minister of Environment and the former Minister of PSD. So in the days when it wasn't a marriage, there were two separate committee mandates. But I know this is something that people point to a lot, but I'm always a lot more optimistic. I would rather those considerations were looked at holistically and in tandem, because I think actually there's quite a lot of mutual inclusivity. So there are quite a lot of infrastructure requirements that you can meet whilst also meeting environmental objectives. So I think it's exactly the right way to approach those big infrastructure issues is with one and the same group of people and taking into account all those considerations on that other part of the mandate. So that's the first thing I would say. I think you're absolutely right that I think one of the problems we all know that we haven't invested as much as targeted for infrastructure. At the moment, these are considerations. I mean, we could break it out into, what we're spending on various different bits of infrastructure. The one that springs to mind immediately, especially given what we've been talking about in terms of the energy policy, and we know where the energy transition is happening. We're in it now. It's happening, and I know it's really tempting to get all the attention usually goes on, oh, are we going to have a wind farm? Or, you know, when's tidal power going to be ready? But actually, the infrastructure to facilitate that on island, you know, in terms of our grid, has to be one of the most important factors. I don't know if Damon wants to say anything about the sort of infrastructure investment more generally, but my final parting comment is that if we get our infrastructure right, it's also going to be more cost efficient in the longer term. You know, again, going back to what I was saying about sprawl being expensive, I think if we get our infrastructure right, then we're going to create fewer we're going to solve more problems than we create for the future.
I think infrastructure is obviously incredibly important, but you don't develop infrastructure for infrastructure's sake.
Yeah.
You do it to enable other things to happen. Deputy Summary's already mentioned the importance of getting your transport network correct, your infrastructure working so that it enables other development to happen. But also there is an option as well to commission to work in partnership with the private sector, but potentially something like the state's decision to come back with proposals for a pool marina are a good example perhaps of where you could look to see where there's commercial viability that could then be used to offset the maintenance costs of these existing infrastructure that you have. So I think it's just a requirement to think a bit differently about how government works, working in partnership with the private sector.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a good point to take a break for about 7 or 8 minutes, and we'll commence part 2 shortly. Thank you. your seats, please, and we're just about to start. Have we got the thumbs up? Okay, welcome to the second half. Just introduce Deputy Aidan Matthews, who's joined us for the second half, and we'll be kicking off with the next lot of questions.
Thanks, Yvonne. I wanted to start off by talking about the blue and green economy. The blue and green economy might appear a little incomprehensible to some members of the public. Does more need to be done to explain the concepts of what these are to in general to the public?
Yes, definitely. And I think it actually builds on what we were talking about just before the break, actually, is the interrelationship between the environment and the economy, and about that symbiosis. So the fact that you can do things that are mutually beneficial, so things that have got environmental benefits, but also economic benefits. So really, at the highest level, that's what the green and blue economy is about. It's about things that are mutually beneficial for both the environment and the economy. But yeah, if you'd like me to use the opportunity now to explain a bit more about what it's about, I can give it a whirl.
Well, if you could very briefly, that might be quite helpful for people. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think we're all quite familiar with how things are. I'll start with the blue economy, because actually we have got a more developed approach to how we use the land. When it comes to our marine environment, however, we don't know as much about it. That's the fundamental thing. And B, we don't have nearly as clearly defined an idea about how we might best use that. So there are various potential uses within a marine environment. Just to name a very few, you've got tourism and leisure-based activities, you've got fishing, you've got renewable energy, marine renewable energy, for example. You've got all sorts of different, you've got also the environmental aspects of your marine ecology. So it's really about, first of all, understanding what we have, and then about finding the best way to maximise the environmental and economic benefits associated with that. So we're quite used, particularly with things like the IDP, about the idea of zoning, for example, in terms of our terrestrial environment. So we know that there are some areas that it's beneficial to focus housing and retail, and some areas where obviously we want to prioritise agriculture, and we're quite used to that approach on land, but we don't have anything similar for our marine environment. And so really it's about understanding what we've got, and making some decisions about what might best go where. So, for example, if there's an area that is really important in terms of fish or other marine life breeding grounds, that could be protected. If there's an area which is going to be much more beneficial than others for renewable energy because of its resource, relating to the depth of the water and the fact that it's not impacting on seagrass beds or whatever, then great. If it's carbon sequestration, this is a really big thing in the blue economy. Carbon sequestration opportunities, which are often much more valuable than their terrestrial equivalents. That's a potentially tradable commodity, really. At the end of the day, it's really important we know what we've got and what we want to do with that in future, and that's really what we're looking at in terms of the blue economy. And obviously, the green economy is a similar approach. So one of the problems that we've had, we're quite good at sort of zoning things and all the rest of it, but I think where we have fallen short is that the environmental benefits and associated economic benefits of those environmental benefits never really make it onto any balance sheets. So, for example, planning applications come forward, there is, a lot of noise, objection to people building on green spaces. Now, if you look at the sort of a classic accountant sheet, that as a green field has got a nominal value, which is the cost of buying the land, but we don't take into account its environmental value. So we don't take into account whether it's a wetland or whether it's got mature woodland on it or anything like that. And we also don't take into account the ecosystem services that it's providing. So, for example, water filtration, air filtration, soil stability, really important. These are all layers of what we call natural capital, as well as obviously the sort of leisure, recreational, mental health, well-being, opportunities for physical activity. These are all really important aspects that need to be taken into account when you're trying to understand how to value an area. It's not just about monetary value. So the green economy side of things is really about developing what we call our natural capital accounts, which is all those layers of information which can better inform decisions and better inform our planning and policies.
Putting a price on nature?
Well, it's not putting a necessarily monetary price on nature, but at the moment, the value of nature on the balance sheets is zero. So although it doesn't necessarily equate to how much it would cost to buy a certain area, it does help inform decisions about what you're really potentially losing if you use an area of land or what you're potentially gaining if you protect it. So it does help inform financial decisions because it shines a spotlight on the real value, not just the superficial economic value.
But then I think there's been some criticism of that approach in terms of the putting a price on nature aspect, wherein a developer could simply pay that price and then degrade that land. That's not a route we're going down.
No, absolutely not, and it doesn't work like that. What it does, and this is true of both the blue and the green economy, is, and this is actually why developers often welcome this approach as well, because it de-risks that process. It provides greater clarity, greater certainty, and it means that if you've got two areas, let's say, two sort of green areas in inverted commas, or potentially ideally an area that's not green, it's a brownfield site, you would be able to say, actually, I know it might superficially seem as though the greenfield site is a more attractive option because it might cost you less to develop, but we understand that that has got a higher value in its totality when you take into account the non-monetary aspects, and so therefore you can put in place policies to make sure that those aspects are protected. So it's not about just saying, well, you pay a higher price. But I would also say that irrespective of how this, any of those criticisms, I have to reiterate the point that at the moment, the economic value of nature is zero on all balance sheets. That is the most fundamental thing that we need to change. We need to get across that even though it's not necessarily in monetary terms, there is a greater value, a greater qualitative value associated with the natural environment that does need to inform policy, planning policy, for example, and it does need to inform investment decisions. And we do need to take it into account in how we're planning, the future of the island going forward. This is a very, very valuable asset or a set of assets. We're a very small island. We don't have a lot of land. And we need to make sure that we are protecting the bits that most need protection, enhancing or restoring the bits that could benefit most from being restored. And this is the tool that will help us to do that. So it's not about saying, oh, you can carry on as usual if you pay a bit more money. It's about shaping that range of options in the first place.
May I just ask a supplementary on that, Chair, please? I think it's interesting throughout those comments when you've been talking about the blue and green economy. It sounds as though pragmatically you've been making sure that there's no bad trade-off between the nature part of things, the environmental part of things, but you also mentioned tourism, and you also mentioned social, and you also mentioned economic, and I think, of course, that's the right way to look at it. There was talk some short while ago about could Guernsey aspire to perhaps developing something like a Guernsey Eden Blue project, and of course that would be a commercial development, but of course it would coexist nicely with all of those different aspects of the policy area mandate that we're talking about, I think is fair to say.
Totally, and actually Deputy Haskins and I, and Deputy Gabriel as well, were in a briefing yesterday which was really fascinating about green jobs, really. And I think that's another really, one of the things that seem to come through is one of the potential biggest opportunities for Guernsey is ecotourism. There are, if we start talking about green jobs, we'll be here for a good hour on that topic alone, I think. But It's certainly it's a drum that I've banged for a while. Is I think we can make more of our natural environment. You know, we're quite good at featuring our natural environment in posters when it comes to our tourist marketing material, but I don't think we're as good at all the stuff underneath that level. It's certainly something I've been interested in and talking with various committees for economic development over the years, and I do think that it is something that they are starting to consider much more seriously now.
Just coming in because we're talking about the green economy there. Guernsey's set itself up, or would like to set itself up as a centre for green finance, to do finance investment, green finance investment internationally. Does Guernsey need to walk the walk as well as talk the talk? Do we need to be seen to have strong environmental policies here? And if we don't, does that hinder elsewhere green finance initiatives, or could it hinder green finance initiatives?
Yeah, Deputy Matthews has just pretty much put it in a nutshell what my answer would be. I was having a conversation earlier this week, in fact, with someone who is responsible for green finance. Deputy Matthews is quite right. We position ourselves on the international stage as a green and sustainable finance centre, and we are a member of quite an elite body called the UNFC4S for Finance Centres for Sustainability. We are, I think, the only Crown dependency to be a member of that body. So we are a mover and shaker. We're quite innovative, actually, in terms of green finance. We've got a couple of world firsts under our belt. So it is a strategic position. It's not just a product. It's not just about the fact that you can get green products. The whole point about being a green and sustainable finance centre is it is an ecosystem, if you'll pardon the pun. It is a one-stop shop, and it's a systemic approach. So it's not just about the availability of green products, it is about that whole package. It's where the future of finance is headed. You know, the ESG considerations and carbon impact considerations are increasingly important part of the finance industry. But to answer your question, first of all, I would say, I think Guernsey often does a really good job of talking ourselves down rather than up. Let's not forget that we do have some really good examples of what we do well. And our waste strategy is one of those. And so you're absolutely right. It's very, very important that because we are positioned strategically, it's an economic policy decision to position ourselves as a green and sustainable finance centre. It is really important that we don't run the risk of accusations of greenwash. That is the single biggest risk, and that is what I get from people who are on the front line of green finance all the time, is that we need to be able to demonstrate that we as a jurisdiction are walking the walk. Absolutely, I get it. I've had it for years. That's always the number one bit of feedback that we get. But we can point to some successes, the waste strategy being one of them. We are held up as an example of best practice in waste circles internationally. So when we first introduced our new waste strategy, and people on the panel were quite instrumental in that, we went, in the first full year of implementation, not only did we exceed our 2030 recycling rate in one fell swoop, and we hit 73%, I think it was, in that first year of implementation, and the target was 70%. But I think more importantly, and the bit that doesn't get as many of the headlines, is that we managed to reduce our overall waste by 11%. So the waste hierarchy prioritises, again, the avoidance, the prevention of waste, the minimisation of waste. So I think actually an 11% reduction overall, all of the waste streams, is a really significant achievement. And certainly that's something that we can legitimately point to. We're well known for it. I'm going to just give a slightly different level, but actually our approach to invasive and non-native species is another example of where we're recognised well beyond our borders as having a really good approach, and people look to us as an example of best practice, and they learn from us. So we're really happy to share that with them. So we do have things we can point to, but we also have areas where we definitely need to improve. And as I say, I was in a meeting just earlier this week with green finance industry leaders telling me exactly that.
Do you think that that connection is well understood? Because it might be that people might think that Guernsey is such a small location, it's a small population and land area, that our environmental policy might not make a big difference globally. So do you think that connection is understood?
Not as much as it should be, I agree. I think we need to do a much better job. But actually, the conversation I was having this week was all about how we get that message through to the wider population, also to the political body as well, because I don't think that is necessarily recognised to the degree that I think it ought to be.
Okay. I'll get back on
on track.
Onto the blue economy and the blue economy. The government work plan mentions a blue economy supporting plan, which is necessary to develop the blue economy effectively in the island. Is that a work stream that has started? Is it in progress? Is it how far along is it?
Yeah, it's in its early stages, but it is. There's been a lot of preparatory work, and I don't really know where the preparatory work ends and the actual work streams begin. I think it's all part and parcel of the same thing. And work is definitely underway. I've mentioned before, as has Damon, about the work plan process. So we do actually have quite a granular timeline on the various aspects of that work that will feed into the Blue Economy Support Plan.
And are those plans going to be subject to comprehensive consultation and awareness raising with stakeholders and the public?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to understand about this area of our work is that we've got very close connections with the environmental community, if I can put it that way. Anyway, so one of the things that we have is a Biodiversity Partnership Group, which is an umbrella organisation which brings together third sector stakeholders, and those groups typically include experts in their own field. So although we don't have lots of different areas of expertise in-house, we do have really good access to local experts, and absolutely we'll bring in expertise from beyond our shores if required. So yeah.
So there are some terms that are mentioned as part of the Blue Economy supporting plan. Can we talk through what a natural capital pilot and if that started and if...
Yep. So there are two aspects to the natural capital pilot. There is a blue bit and a green bit. And actually, it's interesting that you pick on this element because originally the plan was to do the blue aspect first, but we've got a new director of natural environment in position now. And one of his first roles, he's only been in the role for a couple of months. One of his first tasks was to review our priorities and our work streams. And I believe that there may be some suggestions forthcoming about how we can progress that work stream a little bit more efficiently by capitalising on the expertise required for the both of them, if you see what I mean. So, yeah. Do you have anything to add, Claire?
No, I think that just to add that will come through the government work plan process. So as part of the refresh of the government work plan, we're just looking to see whether or not there are elements for the green economy support plan that actually can be brought forward and delivered at the same time as the similar piece in the blue economy support plan, so that there's efficiencies in delivering the two together. So there's a piece of work very much ongoing at the moment as part of the government work plan process to see whether the phasing can be shifted slightly to have those benefits.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And the last one, that's, and with the blue and green economy plans and the strategy for nature and the nature commission, how will they dovetail with a requirement for development of infrastructure and especially of additional housing on the island?
Well, there's an aspect which is biodiversity net gain, which is a more specific planning-related framework, I suppose. This has been adopted in the UK as well as other places, and that's one of the things that we're looking to pilot. And in fact, we are informally, voluntarily piloting it. You know, some developers are already beginning to do this. Now, the interesting thing about it is the fundamental premise of this concept is that there is inevitably a bit of a trade-off, isn't there? If you're going to develop an area that was previously undeveloped or underdeveloped, you know, not as developed, you're going to have a negative impact on the environment. You're going to be taking things away. So the idea of biodiversity net gain is not simply that that is compensated for in other ways or in other areas, but that actually over time there is a net gain in that you end up with more value. And it comes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of being able to assess the overall value of a piece of land. So it's not just about square footage or verges or whatever. It's not just saying there's you know, a verge of green land here. It's about saying, well, actually, what habitats does this provide? What ecology does it support? What are all the other things? So one verge is not necessarily, you can't just do it in terms of land area. You have to look at the value as well and potentially added value. So even though there is an argument to say, well, look, if we need to keep building houses, we're going to be losing more and more land. Yes, but actually, two of the biggest problems that we have in terms of our biodiversity value, if you like, is undermanagement and overmanagement of land that we have. So if we manage land better, we can get far greater environmental value out of it. So the concept of biodiversity net gain, you might think, would put developers off. But actually, one of the things that I was surprised to learn through this process is that developers really welcome it because it de-risks the process. And we all know what it's like in terms of a planning application. You know, developers will bring forward a planning application, and then sometimes all hell will break loose because of some you know, green land being developed or whatever. And that's all really understandable. But from a developer's point of view, it's a risk, and there is cost associated with that risk because it might mean that influences the planning decision, and you know, they get rejected and they've put a lot of money into that, and they might, you know, have to appeal, and it spreads out in terms of time. So the interesting thing is developers really seem to welcome biodiversity net gain because it provides a lot more clarity, a lot more certainty. They know what they're dealing with up front because you've got that baseline information which can inform what is going to be there. So they already know if there is an area that is, you know, more valuable in ecological terms, for example, than another. They know to scope that out. That they know not to go near that. And it also gives them an opportunity to be able to say, well, yes, we appreciate there is some environmental, you know, negative impact, but this is what we're doing to overcompensate on, you know, for that loss on the other side. So it's actually a really helpful framework, and at the end of the day, it helps reduce risk, it helps reduce time, and it helps reduce cost. And ultimately, you get better environmental benefits out of it as well, because instead of just, you know, at the end of an appeal, the planning decision going, oh, fine, you know, you can develop there, it means that there are development planning criteria, planning conditions that say, well, you can, but only if you do it in this way that is most sensitive to the environment, and you've got this compensation, you know, aspect to it as well.
I think you're absolutely right that in your point that green topography is not the absolute scorecard of biodiversity success by any means. And I think the point you touch on from a business point of view, what businesses want when they're making investment decisions or development decisions is an element of certainty around the process. But of course, they also have significant responsibilities now, fortunately, that have been almost imposed upon them for CSR, but more importantly now, which is sort of morphed to ESG. Yeah. It means that they actually have an imperative as corporates to actually be able to support the result of improved biodiversity rather than just the measurement of the green topography land. So I think businesses are now coming much more towards government to want to work in a meaningful way with momentum. And I think if that can be harnessed and developed, I think corporates now are set up to actually engage in a meaningful way now. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. And I think also it touches, another thing that it does is it helps relationship, I suppose, with the community. So it's not just about between corporates and government. It's very much about giving the community a voice and the assurance that their concerns are recognised and responded to. So I think it's win-win-win.
Does it help with, I know, I'm not entirely sure what the biodiversity net gain, what the criteria are and what the factors are, because one of the things I've always felt sort of maybe a little overlooked is how visible some of the green spaces are to people. And I know we've talked before about, there's a specific example near to the school we both know from our primary school.
We often bump into each other on that particular school run, yes.
And that's an area that might not be highly rated in a planning process, but one which might be quite visible to the public. Is that something that is a...
Yeah, I think what you touch on is a really important point, in that it's not just, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about natural capital accounting. It's about a number of different layers, quite a number of different layers. And so there is ecological / biodiversity value, the sort of habitat value, there's all that side of things. But you're quite right to point to the fact that there are social values as well. Obviously, aesthetic value is one of them, but I think there are studies that show, just in terms of the sort of mental health and well-being aspects of being near a green space, even if it's not necessarily a green space you can go and run around in and or, take a walk through. And I would say that this was recognised in the original IDP process, and it was possible through that process to protect more areas of open land. Which are the kinds of things, and they can just be protected for their own right. I think one of the things I'm hoping the IDP review process may allow is, I don't think there was as much awareness as there is now in retrospect of that potential function of the IDP. And I think that is actually a provision within planning law that should be given greater credence, awareness. I think we need to bolster that in a way, because I think that is more important than was perhaps initially recognised by those taking part in the consultation, the very, very thorough consultation process which shaped the IDP in the first place. But I think actually what you're talking about is the importance of protecting areas of open land for their own sake, really, or protecting green spaces, not necessarily just for their biodiversity value, but actually for the for providing a bit of space in an otherwise, built-up area. It's got a value in its own right, and that's exactly the kind of thing that can be captured in natural capital accounting, and perhaps in the review of the IDP.
I'd like to move on now to just a couple of questions on the Development Agency, to the extent that it touches your mandate. Do you believe the role of your committee might be affected by the establishment of the Development Agency and its potential future plans for the Eastern Seaboard, and if so, how?
Well, we've got infrastructure and environment in our mandate, so it can't not affect us. And when it comes to that macro planning, absolutely, I'm very pleased that the first priority of the Development Agency will be that strategic direction. That's going to have a fundamental impact on our mandate, I think, in terms of that bigger picture and what we can bring forward. I think one of the problems that has existed, in recent history, is that it's been difficult to progress. And I'm not talking about any specific problems that we as a committee have really encountered. In fact, there is one project that has got up and running in the form of the Valette, Vive la Valette development, in spite of this. But I think one of the issues has been that until you've got that strategic direction, it's very difficult to bring forward certainly anything macro, because you can't compromise future possible options. So I think, however we get there, decisions on that strategic direction are going to be really helpful in with particular relation to our sort of macro infrastructure mandate. And I don't know, Damon might have something more to add on that.
I agree with that. Just to say that really the Development Agency is a delivery mechanism. It's as Deputy Summeress has said, it's for the states ultimately through the approval of the strategic direction to set where the priorities are. but the Development Agency will work within that framework to deliver.
Okay, and there was a suggestion in the debate in the Assembly last week that that the states should get out of the way of the Development Agency, but there was also reference which to cutting procedures and policies that can slow development, and the potential impact of that. I mean, presumably that's not something your committee would support, is it?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the committee with a view on that because we haven't had an opportunity to meet to discuss since that debate took place. But I can certainly say in terms of my personal opinion that I would just refer you back to the comments that Mr. Hackley has just made about it being a delivery vehicle, and that actually the strategic decisions sit with the states, and actually touching on one conversation further back than that is the importance of engaging the community and other stakeholders. So I think if the Development Agency can act as a body that better coordinates those different stakeholders and you know, with a greater focus on moving things along without cutting corners, then fantastic. But yeah.
But in your view, the Development Agency will need to accord with the various policies and procedures of the states, even though it's at arm's length.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see that there's any other option. I mean, no other. Even as the states, we can't override planning laws and things like that. So,
Mr. Hackley, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just to add to that, that was actually spelled out within the policy.
It is, but I think some of the debate didn't follow that line.
It wouldn't be exempt from the Island Development Plan policies, for example, or any other procedures. It was just, I think the policy letter was saying to not introduce further states' control than are already in place through mechanisms such as the planning system.
Thank you. The Nature Commission, when's that going to be formed?
Oh, very excitingly, that's well underway. I don't know if Claire might have an update on specifically when, but we're well advanced. And let me just see if I can see an exact date. No, but I know that we've made all the sort of we talked through quite a lot of detail and we've made all those decisions, and so I think it's at a point at the moment where some of the legal T's are being crossed and I's are being dotted, but it's progressing really well. I'm very excited about the opportunities that presents.
And how do you anticipate
sorry, Claire might have more information.
I was just going to say we're actually ahead of schedule.
Yeah, we are actually ahead of schedule. Let's not forget to mention that.
How do you anticipate the membership will be populated on the Commission?
Well, there's an interim board, and that interim board will then recruit the full board. But again, there's going to be a focus on ensuring that it's a good balance of representation there.
And this is going to work along similar lines to the Arts Commission or the Sports Commission, is it?
Yeah, I think there's possibly a fairly big difference between the two. I think Health Improvement Commission might be a slightly closer model. But yes, ultimately it's a vehicle through which the states can obviously provide some funding, and it can attract private investment or outside investment into that, so amplify the effectiveness of what we could do just with states' money alone.
Okay, and what power will the Commission hold in order to effectively influence government and achieve its objections, especially the environmental objectives?
So a lot of the Commission's role can be around educating and coordination, so bringing different bodies and areas of expertise together. So yeah, I think it should have. I don't really understand the question, I suppose.
It doesn't. So the Commission doesn't actually have any direct power on influencing policy.
No, it's an independent. It's going to be an independent sort of arm's length body. And it will advise us as well as
right.
as well as other.
Okay, I'll turn now to Deputy Matthews.
Thinking about the COP26 and the extension of the Paris Agreement to the bailiwick. In practical terms, what impact does that have?
Well, much of I don't see any conflicts really with what is already set out in our climate change policy and indeed energy policy, because all is in alignment there. And really, I think the main benefits are that international stage that we were talking about. It's a very strong signal that we take our international obligations seriously. It allows us to amplify aspects, such as green finance, like we were talking about earlier. But also, I think it provides greater focus and potentially frameworks to make that progress more efficient. So, yeah, it certainly doesn't conflict. We were already in alignment with the timelines and high-level aims set out in the Paris Agreement, and I think it gives us an opportunity to, wherever possible, accelerate those.
Okay. In the States last October, you mentioned we were talking about the Global Island Partnership.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain to me what it is, and if we've made steps to join it and what that might mean for us?
Yeah. So GLIPSA, and please don't ask me exactly what I can never remember, but it is the Global Islands Partnership or Alliance or something like that. And really it recognises that islands have got quite specific environmental considerations and often practical sort of challenges that don't exist for bigger jurisdictions. Quite often it comes down to scale. So we know this, even if we just look at our public services and how those are delivered, we know that in terms of our fire service, if we were a town in the UK, we wouldn't have a hospital the size of our hospital. We wouldn't have a fire service the size of our fire service, because we'd be able to draw on resources from further down the road or, bigger neighbouring conurbations. So scale is often a particular challenge, but there are several things that islands have in common. And really, GLIPSA is an opportunity to share and benefit from best practice, what's worked elsewhere, what hasn't worked elsewhere, so that we can more accurately, I suppose, refine what we think will work best for us, and also share some of the successes that we've had. So yeah, those conversations have been ongoing. I think we're sort of informally, we've been informally involved with them for quite some time, and I think it's going to be a very useful resource for us going forward.
Who else is it? Is it Crown dependencies or just other small islands?
It's a real mix, and certainly not related, restricted to Commonwealth, and it's a very global approach. Yeah.
Talking about islands, transport is always a struggle on islands, or different to large countries. Have we made any progress on island transport since your last update?
Have we made any progress? Yeah. I mean, obviously, in terms of, we spend something like £60,000 a week on maintenance of our roads. Actually, Mr. Luxon might know all this even better than me. So I don't think we can overlook the importance of the sort of business as usual aspect. But certainly what I was talking about earlier in terms of this sort of step change approach that we need to take with specific reference to delivering on housing, I think is going to be the most significant thing, hopefully, that we can deliver this political term.
You give us a couple of examples about how changes to on-island transport might reduce our carbon emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always tempting. We see this in lots of stuff, and when you talk about energy, we always go to the big power, the offshore wind farm before we look at things like more mundane things, but possibly more effective things like insulation and energy efficiency. And the same is true of transport. You say transport and people automatically think of wheels and vehicles. And they automatically think, oh, EVs, that will solve it all. But that's not the case. Our climate change policy actually takes into account not just Scope 1 emissions, but Scope 3 as well. And so that takes into account the embedded carbon in the production phase of vehicles. So that's from a sort of purely carbon point of view. We need to be focusing for all kinds of reasons, for reasons of spatial efficiency, for reasons of affordability, for reasons of climate change. We need to be focusing first and foremost on low energy and energy efficient means of transport. So rather than just, jumping straight to we just need to get everyone into EVs as quickly as possible, we do need to be looking at it through that slightly broader lens. And that has got so many, the brilliant thing about it is that it's got so many symbiotic benefits. And I think transport is really at the intersection between lots of areas that we are all concerned about. So housing being one of them, the sort of what's been coined the cost of living crisis in the UK. So that area, affordability, cost of living concerns, which, I think there is growing concern given to that. Climate change, obviously, health. So transport, the great thing is that the solutions that work for one, so let's take climate change, population is another really important aspect to that, work for all of those things. So if we can improve the efficiency of our transport system, then that helps with all those different aspects. I think I talked earlier about shared mobility. I think that's going to be a really important bridge mechanism, if you like, because infrastructure is super important. We know that if we want to enable and facilitate active travel, then infrastructure interventions are going to be the most important way of delivering that. But even then, we know that we're not going to get everyone, it's not always going to be practical for everyone to walk somewhere or ride a bike or take a bus. So I think the shared mobility aspect is something I get quite excited about, because it is using a mode that we're all very familiar with in a more efficient way, and it reduces the pressure on spatial land use, and it enables us to develop more spatially efficiently, which means we're able to develop in a more cost-effective manner, which results in a reduction of pressure in terms of cost of living and affordability.
Yes, I was thinking that being a small island and being constrained by things like having narrow roads and a small road network, it limits the ability to which you can do things like put cycle lanes in, and it makes some roads more difficult to walk on. Is that a constraint on our active travel policies or take up?
No, I don't think so, because it's about using the space that we have available to it. I completely agree that we've got granite-hemmed roads often, and we can't easily expand them. But you look at places which do expand them, and they don't solve their problems. My brother lives in Canada. They've got something called Highway 401 going through where he lives. And, I think for decades they've been going, we'll just add another couple of lanes, that'll fix it. No, everything just gets worse. So I think even if we had more space available, I don't think it would solve the problems that people assume it would solve. I think the way we need to look at it is, how do we use the space available to us most efficiently? And I think there are quite creative solutions. I think, we work with Jersey and their active travel. So again, this comes back to the island appropriate solutions. We can't just lift solutions from an American city necessarily and expect it to work, because that might not be an island or Guernsey appropriate solution. But it's really helpful talking with Jersey, because they've got very similar infrastructure, and coming up with some more creative solutions. So I'll just give one practical example, if you like. There is one of the barriers to people walking is that they feel as though it's not safe enough, and we've got lots of lanes, especially out of town, which don't have any pavement at all. They're just a lane. And those in particular, we often get complaints, especially when they're near schools, that people don't feel safe walking along them, because there's, as far as people behind the wheel of a vehicle are concerned, it's their domain, they're in a vehicle, and other people are infringing on that. That's this kind of subconscious and quite understandable reaction. So people don't always feel very safe. But there may not, as you say, be enough space to put in a formal footpath. So if it's not heavily trafficked, if there's not a lot of vehicle movements going through, one quite neat solution that Jersey put in place is poles, which are spaced far enough apart that a vehicle can pull in, but they can't do the equivalent of pavement surf along it. So it still protects some space, demarks and protects some space for people walking without compromising necessarily the certainly their safety, but also the movement of vehicles in either direction. So that can work well under some circumstances. That's an example of an island-appropriate intervention that we can maybe look to see whether it would be appropriate in some places here.
Yes, because I think it sort of affects things like cycling as well, where I think it's sometimes harder on the island, on the narrow roads to... When I was talking about adding lanes, I was talking about more about adding cycle lanes than adding traffic lanes.
So you're right. And again, when we think about people riding bikes, we know, because we've asked them and they tell us every single time, that one of the biggest barriers to people riding bikes is that they don't like mixing with motor traffic. There are, we've got the space that we have available to us. There are sometimes options to reorganise how we manage that space, because quite often we don't organise it very well in the first place. And I will use Bobany as an example. Before the schools were put there, most of those lanes around there were two-way, and the idea of a one-way system with contraflows was heavily opposed by the local resident population. And interestingly, because I think they assumed that it would be less convenient for them, if they couldn't drive in both directions. But actually, that scheme went ahead. And when you speak to the residents who've lived throughout that, for a long time in that area now, it's really interesting because, some admit that they were completely opposed to the idea before it went in, but actually find it an awful lot more convenient now because they're not having to constantly reverse back down a lane because there's another, vehicle coming towards them and all of this kind of stuff. So actually, sometimes by using our space more cleverly, we can make it more convenient for people driving, and actually safer and more convenient and more attractive for people walking or riding a bike as well.
Is that something we could do more of, looking at those sorts of one-way systems or use of space?
Certainly, those are all in the mix of considerations, and I spoke a little bit earlier in the first half about some mobility planning and network planning. It's exactly that kind of... I think connectedness is another really important point. A safe walking route is only as safe as its least safe link. If there's a really great pavement or something all the way from St Martin's to town, but there's a nightmare crossing, which we all know there are two of them actually. We know that puts people off, because even though most of the journey might be perfectly good, if you have one weak link, it is enough to make people feel unsafe and enough to put people off. So we know that continuity and that connectedness is a really important aspect, and that's why we look at network planning. It's that connectedness that really matters.
Yeah, sure. We talked about fragility of oil and gas supply earlier. Food also is coming to this equation now, and there has been over the last couple of decades talk about higher levels of locally grown food, restrictions and objections from local food retailers that want standardised and all the rest of it. But do you think that there is scope for your committee or your committee's view, I suppose, on the encouragement of higher levels of locally grown food, with or without subsidy, with or without practical support of facilitation, perhaps? Do you have any thoughts?
I'm going to speak a little bit prematurely because this is an issue that we'll be reviewing over the course of the year. So I'm really now speaking from my personal perspective and not necessarily from speaking for the committee on this. But I don't think anyone would argue that it would not be a good thing for us to be more resilient and to have more locally grown produce. I think there are wins across the board with that, in terms of the nutritional value of the food, in terms of the food miles, the environmental considerations, and of course in terms of the sort of local economy, and most importantly in terms of that sort of resilience. It's going to, the more food we can grow here, the more resilience we can build into our own system. However, I think it is also important to look at this again from a maybe slightly broader perspective, because as an island, I don't believe that we've been self-sufficient for food for many centuries. And so I think we do have to be quite realistic about what we mean by... It's a bit like energy independence. If you're being purist about it, there's no such thing. but we can certainly become more energy independent, and we certainly can become more food, independent, if you want to use the same kind of term. But I think there are certainly lots of benefits. I was just thinking back, there was a fantastic speaker called Dr. or Professor Dave Goulson, who the Pollinated Project brought over a few years ago. And he, in one of his presentations, pointed out that actually allotments tended to be far, far more productive than commercially farmed land. So I think when we do look at this, we need to look at it through that broader and obviously have a much greater degree of diversity. It's not just a monoculture, it's often a much sort of more diverse mix of produce that can be grown. So I do hope that when we look at it, we will look at it from that slightly more rounded perspective. But yeah, I think certainly no one's going to argue with the overall aim that it would be great to have more locally grown food. It's just, as you say, a range of considerations around how that might practically be achieved, to what end, and what the potential trade-offs are.
Thank you.
Right, well, we're just coming towards the end. So just to wrap up, are you content with the current operation of the bus contract?
Yeah. The bus contract was actually the source of some substantial savings for E&I when it was last negotiated. So I think a saving of £300,000 compared to what it would have been otherwise. So I think certainly the negotiation of the contract has been successful. I would say with respect to the bus service generally, though, touching back on a theme that we explored in some detail in terms of staff resources earlier, is the main challenge at the moment with the bus service is drivers. So it's well known that we don't have as many drivers as we would like, or CT Plus don't have as many drivers as they would like, and we are looking at a range of potential options to see what we can do to alleviate that situation.
But out with that, which is, numerous pressures, I would imagine, bringing to bear on that. You can sort of hang it on the pandemic, housing, global labour shortages, all sorts of things. Outside of that, the rest of the operation of the bus service, are numbers rising?
Yeah, absolutely. We saw up until COVID, obviously, year-on-year increases to record-breaking levels. So 2019, which was the last non-pandemic affected year, was record passenger numbers in sort of modern history, just shy of, and possibly in real terms over, 2 million passenger journeys in the year, which was phenomenal. I think the one thing with bus policy is that it helps to be consistent. So that's how you build. You don't gain passenger numbers by chopping and changing your routes the whole time. So we're always quite careful to ensure as great a degree of reliability as we can, which is why we are keen to address or ameliorate, support the situation with the drivers at the moment, because that is obviously impacting on the reliability, the provision of the service. So it is having an impact on what routes can be run on particular days, etc. But yeah, there has been a bit of a perfect storm of factors contributing to that, but we are keen to address as many that are within our control as possible.
Mm-hmm. And just finally then, what progress is being made towards an electric fleet? If any.
I think Damon might have more of an update. Certainly we had, you may be aware that we are in the third phase of the bus fleet replacement programme. Up until that point, very frustratingly, and I lay on the tracks over this issue in the previous political term, there was not, up until recently, a bus that met all three of our key criteria, which were specifically the Guernsey specific criteria, which were width. Obviously, we need unusually narrow buses to fit down our roads. Capacity, in that we do have actually quite a high level of passenger numbers, especially at certain peak times, and range in terms of electric, because we're quite hilly as well. So that impacts on range. And up until this political term, there really weren't any vehicles. There were loads that met one, there were quite a few that met two, but there were no vehicles that met all three of those key criteria. And I'm happy to say that, technology has evolved, and there now do appear to be models that do meet those criteria, on the general marketplace. And in fact, we brought one such model over to trial, give it an actual road test, and threaten it with granite rash and all the rest of it. And we went on. We were lucky enough to have a trip on that, and it was a very comfortable ride. So the procurement process, we don't, at policy level, we obviously don't get involved in the operational detail. We're not directly involved in that procurement process. I don't know whether Damon has an update on that side of things, but I understand, certainly the last time we checked in, it was progressing.
Yes.
Progressing well.
It is progressing well. We are, of course, testing that the product that we could potentially purchase is the same as the one that we saw in Guernsey, because there is sometimes you get a better product to be demonstrated. So we are going through that process to make sure that the product is as good as it appeared. But no, that process is underway, phase 3 contract.
Well, thank you. That completes our questions, and thank you to all the witnesses for attending and increasing the public understanding of the work that your committee does. Thank you to the members of the media for attending and those members watching on the live stream. Scrutiny undertakes regular public hearings with all of the principal committees and others to increase public understanding of key areas of government policy. The next hearing will be on the 26th of April, and that's with the Development and Planning Authority. So the hearing is now closed, and thank you, everyone.